Hey, welcome back to part 2 of the masterclass on hand tracking. If you haven't seen part 1, I've got a link to that video in the description. Go ahead and watch that first. Part 2, we're going to be exploring how to make the UI for the hand tracking interface. If you're hoping to just get the project file, I've got a link to that on my Patreon. But if you follow along for the rest of the tutorial series, you should be able to make it from scratch. Cool, enjoy. Let's go ahead and start drawing out our interface. So I want to draw the line between our index finger and our thumb and be able to add in some data points there. And really the easiest thing to do first, like if you want to make a visualization, is to just put an over and composite this hand tracking visual on top of MediaPipe. This is going to be like the simplest setup, and maybe you want to turn off the overlays here on MediaPipe so that we're just getting the points. This is already drawing some white dots for us. So one of the things that I did that's just a really quick way of only rendering the points for your pointer finger and your thumb is to go ahead and right click on this, and we're going to hit view and make it a little bit smaller. And so we're getting all these data points, but really if we go inside this component, you'll notice that we have this point render here that is actually generating the points for us. A really simple way of getting around this is to basically put in a trim, and what we can do is set it to absolute. And now when we hold our first hand, we can start to increase this value until we get our pointer finger. So I think it's at, should be 8, I think. And then we want to get our next point. So we're gonna put another trim. We want to merge these together, but the way that this instancing data works is that it needs to be as single channels. So we'll merge, put a merge top down, connect these two, but notice it doesn't show up correctly. And what we need to do is put down a shuffle. We're going to sequence all channels by name. And basically we're going to get a unique X, Y, and Z channel. And we can start to change this data point, and now we'll see both those points showing up. So we can nudge this around until we find, okay, so it's 4. So index 4 is our thumb, index 8 is our index finger. And let's go ahead and do our other hand. This one's going to be a little bit trickier because I've got to hold both hands up. So I'm going to duplicate this trim. I memorized this one, so I know it's actually 25 for my thumb. And I think the other one is what, like 4 higher. So the next one's going to be, we'll connect this, 29. So we should have both of those mapped. So that's a super easy way if you just want to draw the circles for specific points. This same technique will also work with the face tracking data where you've got a number of points that you're instancing. But we're going to go in and make our own little helper component shortly that will basically allow us to render any piece of geometry, like the lines or text or other UI that's gonna like layer on top. So the next thing we're gonna do is make another base for ourselves, and I'm gonna call this our interface. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull in all of our hand tracking data, our video, and we're gonna overlay everything here. So let's go ahead and go inside, and I'm gonna make an in. Our first in is gonna be our hand data. Our next one is going to be our helpers. And then we're also gonna make a in for our video. And we can give these specific numbers because they might be out of order. So let's give this a connection order of 1. This is going to be, let's set it to like a higher number. I always want this at the end, like 6 or something like that. And basically what we'll do is connect our hand data. It's going to be our first one. Our helper data is going to be our next input. Maybe you'll want gestures. Let's go ahead and put gestures in here as well. So I'll make another in. Depends on what you're hoping to map. And we'll make this our third input, and we're going to call it gestures. And we'll connect our gesture data. That's the gesture data is this like final output coming here. And lastly, we'll input our video. Okay, great. So we've got all of those. So the next thing I want to do is render the line between my index finger and thumb. So we're going to use the hand data for that. So I'm going to connect a null here. And I think the easiest way to do this is actually using the line SOP. So if we put this down, we'll see that there's an X, Y, and Z and 2 different points we can give it. I want to just pass a reference here, but there's almost too many points. So I'm going to put a select first, just so we can narrow it down. And I'm going to select out our index finger tip. That's going to be our X. I'm going to put a star here, just so we can easily find the channel names. And I'll go over to our line here. I'm going to put this null in an active mode, and I'm going to drag and drop a reference for our first point to hand one's index fingertip X. We're going to pass it for our Y and our Z. And so we should see in these references X, Y, and Z for our index fingertip. Cool. So we're going to do the same thing, but instead for our thumb. So let's go ahead and select our thumb, index, H1, thumb, tip. I see Y here, so I'm going to put a star after it. So it's index, thumb, colon, star. And now what I'm going to do is drag a reference from our thumb tip over to reference, and we should see that updating, which is great. And if you wanted to do the same thing, but instead for your hand 2, what we could do is instead of H1, we'll do H star and H star. So we're just selecting those 2 channels, and then we'll duplicate this line. And now you can go in and you could drag a reference if you wanted, but it's very easy for me to just go in and change these references to a 2 instead for the index fingers. Here's 2, 2, 2. Beautiful. And now we want to render these. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this to a geometry. If you right click on these little tabs on the line, it will automatically connect our setup for our geometry a lot easier. I'll just duplicate this geometry and connect this one here. And basically what we want to do is render this and composite it with our visuals. So I'm going to need a camera. We're going to customize the camera in just a second. Then I'm going to put down a render. And for lights, maybe for now, I'm just going to connect a constant material to these. You could use a line material for this if you want as well, but that way it should just render all white. That's going to be the easiest. And we're going to put a over, and we're going to composite this over our video. And then we're going to make an out. And the reason we make an out is now, if we zoom out, you'll see that we have this as a little output toggle for ourselves. So if I make it null, we can see we're getting the overlay. Okay, but now we need to actually customize things correctly. So first thing, let's fix the resolution of our renderer. And I want to make sure that it matches whatever the input video is. So for that, we'll put down an info chop. I'm going to drag and drop this video onto the info chop, and then I'm going to put a null afterwards. And you'll notice that there's this resolution X and Y. So what we're going to do is go to the renderer, and in the common tab, we'll put this in an active mode, and we're going to drag and drop from this 1280 for the resolution X, pass that as a reference, and then for our resolution Y, we'll pass that as a reference, and maybe we'll put this as a 32-bit float as well. Now, the last thing that we need to fix is our camera. Well, second to last thing we need to fix is our camera. We actually have to adjust our data points as well. But our camera, we actually want to change it from a perspective camera here. If we go to the view, the perspective camera we want to change to orthographic. And then we want to set our width to 1, and that's going to give us a much better format. You don't need a far plane this far away, so you can actually set this much lower. That gives you a little bit better compute. And hopefully that should put it in a slightly better spot, but it's not going to be quite there yet because our Y values are still going to be pretty far off because our Y values aren't scaled to our aspect ratio. The way we need to fix that is by inserting a math, and we need to go to the common section and basically snag anything that's a y value. So the way that this format works, you'll notice that they end with :y for anything that's a y value. So actually, if you do $:y, this expression will apply to every single y value. And now what we want to do is basically take this and like scale our y values based off our aspect ratio. So what we can do is actually get a reference to our resolution y here, and we'll pass that as a reference. And we want to basically snag this, and we're going to divide it. I'm going to paste the same expression, but change it to res x. And now these should be aspect corrected. And I think we need to set this to bottom left. There we go. And that's the last piece. And now we've got our overlays. These lines look teeny. So what we want to do instead, you can go ahead and insert the line thickness here. And maybe let's change this to like 0.01, 0.01 for all of these. And I'll just copy this. I'll make a little space for ourselves and copy this line thickness and use it for both. It's a little flickery, and I'm thinking if we actually just remove the z value from our calculation, that might help, or if we add a normal to it, because these kind of are flipping around quite a bit. So if we insert in attribute create, and we turn on normals, that might help us a little bit. I'll duplicate this and use it for our other one as well. That'll help our lines slightly, but also maybe what we could do is actually just remove this z expression here and just set it to 0. And in theory, that will smooth it out. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So we'll do that for our second hand as well. No need for this z value. It'll map just fine. And yeah, feel free to like play around with the actual line thickness. Maybe this is still a little too thick. I'll tweak it to be a bit smaller. How about 0.05? 0.005. And I'm just going to duplicate this because it'll be quicker. Really, I should just set this up with references, but it'll be fine. Cool. So that's looking good for our overall thickness. And what's nice is that any other geometry that you map here should work really nicely with your geometry. The main thing is this orthographic camera and scaling the y values. We'll actually need to do the same thing for our helper values over here. So I'm going to duplicate this math, and I'm going to replace the wire here and put a null afterwards. And basically now all of our helper data is also fixed to the correct aspect ratio, and we can map it really easily. So the next thing that I want to do is maybe add a label for ourselves that's going to display the scale or something like that for hand 2. So hand 1 we had as a rotate, so we'll need to make a trigger for ourselves so that we can toggle to the next visual when we rotate by a certain amount, but hand 2 was a scale amount. So let's go ahead and make a text. If I put down a geo text, and it's way too big by default, so we're going to go ahead and scale it down in the font size to be quite a bit smaller, like maybe like 0.05. We can kind of see it in the bottom corner here. And then I'm going to just put a constant material and drag and drop it on and place it as the material so it shows up all white. So the thing is, I want this text to actually show up not on my fingertip, but between my pointer and thumb. And for that, we're going to use the helper data for the hand tracking. So that way, as we pinch our hand, that coordinate doesn't fly around. So what we can do is use this X form, this translate, to basically move it around to a particular position. And for that, we're just going to go over to our helpers and put the helpers in an active mode, you'll notice there's this H2 pinch midpoint X. We're going to put that on the translate X, and then the Y is going to be the translate Y, which is great. So now we should see that moving around with our text, and we can also adjust the Y position a little bit. So my trick for doing this is to just quickly move my hand away so I can kind of see like roughly where it is in the air, and we'll adjust our Y by maybe like subtracting off 0.01 or 0.05, 3 to kind of shift it down a little bit. So next we want to write out our scale. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into an expression that says, in quotes, it's going to, for a string, it'll say scale, colon, space, and then we're going to put an expression after this that's going to be whatever our value is for our pinch distance. So we basically want to get the incoming distance, which is over here, our H2 pinch distance. So I'm just going to switch it over to this view for a second so I can drag a reference in. So I'm going to click and drag this pinch distance. I'm going to delete it in a second, but I just want to copy this expression. So I'll paste a reference and I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to go over to our text and I'm going to do a plus sign because we want to combine these together, and I'll paste in this reference. And if I hit enter, I'm going to get an error, and that's because this pinch distance is a float, and basically we're trying to combine that with a string. So what we need to do is wrap this and convert it into a string. The way we can do that is write str with an opening parenthesis, and then if we go to the end, we need to close that parenthesis and hit enter. And now you'll see that we get an absolutely enormous scale. So this really isn't helpful for us. And what we want to do is basically round it. And so there is a round function in Python, and what it lets us do, we can write, after the opening parenthesis for string, we'll write round with another opening parenthesis, and we're going to go to the left of that closing parenthesis and put a comma, because this actually takes a parameter and it says how many decimal places we want. So we'll put in 2, and then we're going to put in another closing parenthesis. So you should have 2 at the end, 1 to close the round, 1 to close the string. Now we'll hit enter and we'll see we get a decimal. Great. So one other thing that I kind of want to change is that when I was recording the videos, the text would be my face a lot. So what I might do is shift the X position for my left hand to be on the inside. So I'll move my hand away quickly, and I'm going to take the X position and subtract off like 0.1. That's not looking quite right. We'll do like 0.3. That's looking maybe 3, 2. That looks good. Cool. So now if I put in my second hand there, cool, it's off to the side now. Hopefully this gives you a sense of how to create your different UI parameters, and you can really map whatever you want here, right? Like you don't need to pass in this pinch midpoint. If you want to create another UI that follows just your fingertip position, you can do that. Hopefully this kind of gives you a couple examples of how to extend the functionality. And also you might notice as well that the scale isn't quite right. So we're actually going to take this clamp math and we're actually going to change it so that it's H star. So now it's actually modifying the pinch distance for hand 1 and hand 2, which is great. So that way we just get our values from 0 to 1. And it also has the same easing that will also apply to our visuals. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is try to make a trigger for ourselves when hand 1 rotates beyond a certain amount. So what we can do here is maybe just select out our hand 1 pinch rotation, and let's take a look at our values. So right now, when my hand is vertical, I want to know if it goes beyond like 180 to the right. And what I really like using for this is just the expression chop. So basically, we'll just write in like, if this value is greater than, or actually is less than 180, if it ever goes below that, this is going to turn to 1. Beautiful. And then what we can do is count every time that that goes to 1. So I'm gonna connect a count, and we only had like 2 videos before that we were really cycling between. So I'm gonna put this limit to loop min max, and we're just gonna loop from 0 to 1. And now you should see that every time that I rotate, it'll go from 0 to 1 and it'll go back to 0. Great. I'm gonna put a null after this, but we also wanna be able to see this visual represented in our hand UI. So what I'm gonna do is go back into our hand UI, and I'm going to put in another chop. And then this is gonna be our trigger. And I don't actually want this count data because I want to just visualize when that trigger is happening. I don't actually want to count what index we're on. Maybe you do. Maybe you want to put in a particular count index. And I'm going to connect this. And I actually want to change the order of this. So I'll go to the trigger and notice this connected order. I'm going to set this to 4. And that way, now this is our second to last input followed by our video. Great, we're getting this little rotation trigger. I kind of liked having this UI where the line would change color and then it would display the text next whenever that trigger happened. So what I'm gonna do actually is I'm gonna make a little space for ourselves. I'm gonna put a lag after this because I want a little bit of easing applied to it. And I want it to kind of like fade in and then take longer to fade out. So when the value is increasing, that's what this first lag is. And when it's decreasing, that's the second value. So I'm gonna make a larger lag when the value is decreasing. So you'll see that when I first rotate, it jumps up and then it takes a while to go down. And I'll make a null. So I'll connect a null to this. And now let's change the color of our line. So I'm going to duplicate this constant material, and let me figure out which line we're actually using for hand 1. So I think it's this Geo1. So I'm going to drag and drop this constant material onto Geo1, and basically what we want to do is have it all white, and then when the trigger happens, we're going to change the color. So a simple way of doing that is basically just to take this trigger, I'll put it in an active mode, and we're gonna drag and drop it over here. And that turns it kind of this blue color when it's 0. So if I wanna flip that so that when no trigger is happening, it's white, I can actually do 1 minus. So now it's all white. And then when I do this trigger, it turns blue and then fades out. Great. And then the last thing that I wanna do is maybe add another little piece of text, but that says next whenever that trigger happens. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to duplicate this geotext and switch it so that the translate is actually hand 1, pinch midpoint distance, and then the text, we'll just, for now, we're just going to set it to the text next. And let's see what that looks like. So it's way too far away. Let's go ahead and shift this X form so that it's not so far to the right. Maybe we don't subtract off that much. Great. Now maybe it needs to be moved left a little bit. I kind of like that when I turn all the way to the right that it's centered. So maybe what I'll do is hold this here and scoot my hand away really quickly, and we'll subtract off a small amount. And then maybe I'll do something similar where I'll scoot it up a little bit higher. So maybe I'll do minus point, or actually, you don't need to subtract anything. And that way, now when I toggle to the right, it kind of sits roughly in the center. So the last thing we want to do is basically make this text appear and disappear whenever it's toggled. So what we can do here is actually use this little expression, and we're going to use what's called a ternary operator in Python. And if you want to learn how to create these expressions, you should ask ChatGPT how to write ternary in Python. First, I need a reference to this. So I'm going to drag and drop this expression on. So here's the expression for whatever our channel is. So then what I'm going to do is put in our string. So it's going to be next if this value is like maybe greater than 0.2, and then otherwise we'll just give it an empty string, so it's nothing. And basically, let's go ahead and take a look at what happens. Now We'll go next, it'll fade out, it'll be there for a second, and then it'll disappear. Great. And you can even make that shorter if you want, depending on what you're feeling. Cool. So I think this gives us a really good starting point for creating our visuals. Hey, thanks for following along for the second tutorial. For the third and final tutorial, we're going to explore how to make some pro quality renderings so that way your videos aren't dropping any frames. And then we're finally going to build out the custom animations. I've got a link to the next tutorial in the description, or you can find it here. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.